the Conservatives are back in power, ironically now with Friedrich Merz, who was the arch-enemy of Angela Merkel, while the three-party coalition who has succeeded Angela Merkel as a progressive experiment aimed to renew Germany has unfortunately failed also in the eyes of the German population.
The results are in, and Germany chose its new chancellor. To the surprise of no one, Friedrich Merz will succeed Olaf Scholz, and Europe can finally get to work after being on hold since November. The challenges are plenty, and Germany's new chancellor has his plate full. Not only he has to deliver on migration and the economy, he must do so to avoid even bigger electoral gains for the far-right AfD next time around.
This term will be the test whether the firewalls still hold if Friedrich Merz manages to reform Germany's migration policy in a way which undercuts support for the AfD on migration. If he's able to bring back and to revive Germany's economy, then he has a chance to bring down the numbers for the AfD. If he's unable to do so, if a coalition with the Social Democrats is marked by political infighting, then it will be much more difficult, because then there will be additional frustration with Germany's political establishment building up, which can lead to even bigger election outcomes for the AfD in the next elections.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova. If you haven't already, please take a moment now to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now, to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. Today on the show, Decoding the German elections. I'm joined by Liana Fix, Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. Liana is a historian and political scientist and an expert in German and European foreign and security policy based in Washington. We spoke on the day after the elections. Here's our conversation. All right, let's dive into it. We're speaking on Monday afternoon for me, Monday morning for you. So just a few hours after the results of last Sunday's elections became known in Germany, there was not much of a big surprise. The polls delivered pretty much what everyone was expecting, but what was for you the biggest surprise, if any?
Yeah, I think there was no surprise if you compare the outcome with the polls, because there were not major shifts. But if you compare the outcome to the last elections 3 years ago, it's quite significant. I mean, we've seen that the progressive coalition, the three-party coalition of Olaf Scholz, has really been punished for the 3 years in power. All progressive parties have lost a lot of the voters' share. We have also seen that the AfD, the right-wing radical party in Germany, has doubled its voter share in those 3 years. So it's the second strongest party after Friedrich Merz's Conservatives. And we have also seen that in the last-minute push, the left-wing party, Die Linke in Germany, has gained some votes more than expected. So the outcome suggests that the Conservatives are back in power, ironically now with Friedrich Merz, who was the arch-enemy of Angela Merkel, while the three-party coalition who has succeeded Angela Merkel as a progressive experiment aimed to renew Germany has unfortunately failed also in the eyes of the German population.
Mm-hmm. And so the German population chose Friedrich Merz as the next chancellor. However, short of an absolute majority, he clinched just below 30% of the vote. Let's talk coalition parties and partners. Who is the likely candidate for you? And by when can Germany expect a new government?
So the hope is German coalition negotiations usually take quite long because there's a German coalition treaty that is negotiated between the parties, but there are signs that Friedrich Merz doesn't want to go this long, down this long path. He wants to have a new government by Easter, by the end of April, and there's certainly pressure that with the international environment now, even the end of April, Easter is still a long time to go, given that Germany has to act on the European level, on Ukraine, on Trump, and so on. But even if Merz wanted to make it faster, he could face some challenges because his only realistic coalition partner at this moment are the Social Democrats. He can build a two-party coalition with the Social Democrats, whereas the Liberals coalition partner that the Conservatives have worked with in the past has not made it into parliament. So it's the Social Democrats or an even bigger three-party coalition with the Social Democrats and the Greens, who are ideologically even further away from the Conservatives. That means the SPD knows, the Social Democrats know that they are the chosen ones, and that gives them leverage in negotiations, making it very likely that the Social Democrats will try to drag out negotiations to get concessions from Friedrich Merz. And this Grand coalition between Social Democrats and the Conservatives is also something that Angela Merkel favored. It was in her 4 terms as a chancellor, she governed over a Grand coalition 3 times.
And what do you think would be the biggest concessions that Social Democrats could get from the Conservatives?
The biggest concession the Conservatives can make is on social welfare. Merz has pledged to cut social welfare, which is something that the Social Democrats have fought for. And the Social Democrats, in return, can make it difficult for Friedrich Merz to increase defense spending, a demand that has also been made by the Trump administration, because Friedrich Merz will have to rely on the Social Democrats and even more on the Greens and perhaps on Die Linke to reform Germany's debt break, which is the biggest challenge to anything that Germany can do to Germany's fiscal space. So it's a difficult position for Merz to be in, who likes to have bold announcements and for others to follow. But this time, the Social Democrats will not follow as a junior partner.
And speaking of bold announcements, Merz struck a very defiant tone against the United States, saying that he wants to strengthen Europe to achieve independence from the United States. You are based in Washington. How was his victory received over there?
Yes, so surprisingly, there has been a very positive post by Donald Trump about the Conservatives, arguing that they are working against on migration, on energy, and are in line with his positions, which is surprising because G.D. Vance as well as Elon Musk have advocated or implicitly advocated to include the radical right-wing alternative for Germany in parliament. So it's a good sign that Donald Trump seems to appreciate the victory of Friedrich Merz, and the Conservatives seems to want to work with them. But Friedrich Merz is clear-eyed enough to see that Donald Trump's America is not a reliable partner, and that's why he wants to strengthen the European Union, defense in the European Union. His comments were perhaps not perfectly timed shortly after Trump's congratulation note, but let's see how this plays out once he visits Washington, D.C.
He said it himself that Europe is waiting for Germany, and this on many different topics. First of all, do you agree that Europe has been waiting for Germany to decide its fate? And if yes, on what?
Well, Europe has actually tried to deal with a German vacuum in the last years. So both France as well as Poland and other countries have tried to make up for the big hole that German politics have been on the European and the international stage in the last years. But of course, it's appreciated if someone is back in Berlin who actually sees the need to work closely with France, with Poland, with the UK on Europe's defense. Merz has already floated that Germany would have to rely on the UK and on France for nuclear protection. So from this perspective, the challenge for Merz will be to work in close cooperation with the other European partners and not to be perceived as the one who now wants to take over the ship. Because there are many others who are competing for leadership role. President Macron certainly sees himself in a leadership role, even if he's domestically weakened. So it's all about cooperating, less about leading from the front. And Merz will have to prove that he can do that and is not just an alpha politician who wants to take the first seat in the role.
So I'm thinking of two things here. One is cooperation, which you mentioned, and then there's the question of leadership. So I'll ask you about cooperation first. That shouldn't be too much of a hard task for Merz. I mean, the president of the commission is a member of his own party. The biggest party in the European Parliament is also the Conservatives in Europe. And there's also quite a few significant European leaders who hail from the same party. So when it comes to cooperation, it seems that he shouldn't struggle too much, correct?
Yeah, but the times are historic. On the one hand, Friedrich Merz wants a place in the history books, but on the other hand, there's a lot of anxiety in Europe about what is the right way to go forward. So, for example, Macron obviously is pursuing a very goalless approach, European Union first, European defense first, under the leadership of France. Merz has spoken positively about this, but the Poles, on the other hand, do not fully trust the French, and they want to place their bet still on a strong transatlantic relationship with Donald Trump. So, translating between all these partners, that's going to be the challenge because the stakes are very high for all of them. It's not just about policies or policy reform. It's about the strategic choices for Europe in terms of their own security and in terms of the partnerships. It's the most probably historically the most volatile moment after 1990, and 1990 was a positively volatile moment. Now we have a negatively volatile moment.
And so, speaking on about leadership, considering that Merz never really had a governing role, position in government, how likely do you see him stepping into this leadership role across Europe, not just in his own country? Would it be a natural leader based on what we know of him?
Well, he certainly sees himself as someone who gives clear instructions, who's strong on leadership, but we've seen in German domestic politics that in terms of tactical maneuvers, he has an impulsive streak to him. So a few weeks before the elections, he has actually passed a motion, an anti-asylum motion through parliament with the votes of the far-right AfD, which is something that goes against the firewall of German centrist politicians. It's parties saying we don't work with the AfD. And that was an impulsive reaction after a terrorist attack in Germany. He had not any gains from that. He has not suffered a lot, but he has also not gained a lot. It was a move that seems to have strengthened more of the left and the right wing parts of the German political spectrum, but that was strategically and tactically a mistake. And so the question is how considerate will Merz act on the European level, because his approach in this asylum motion drama or saga that we had was very much my way or the highway, and that's not necessarily an approach that is going down well with other Europeans.
We'll definitely focus on migration in just a minute. But before, I just want to focus on another policy issue that's perhaps the hottest topic in Brussels right now, that of security and defense for Europe. What can we expect of the new German chancellor on security and defense, and will it be a drastic change?
So Merz has definitely said that security and defense and Europe's security defense is high on his priority, but the question is, what is he willing um, to concede for that? Because there's a clear understanding and consensus that to strengthen European security and defense, Europe will have to take on joint debt and invest in Europe's defense industrial base, which is something that the conservatives traditionally have opposed. They have only allowed for joint debt as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, saying this is not a precedent, this is a one-off. So if Friedrich Merz wants to go down the route of joint EU debt, he will have a hard time convincing his own party that Germany goes into a debt relationship with countries that have a much higher debt rate than Germany has at the moment. So the detail is in the money.
So let's pivot to migration. And we just wrapped up last year where there was the most significant election year that perhaps any one of us can remember. And we've seen time and time and time and again center parties, center right parties who try to focus on migration, who try to steal this issue from far right parties in their own countries, had up massive defeats. And it seems like Merz and the CDU tried also this strategy, which again proved to be the losing strategy. So on migration, it was also a topic that very much dominated the electoral period in Germany, unfortunately for the worst reasons possible, with horrible attacks in the country that just fed into the far right propaganda narrative. How much did migration contribute to the final outcome, and in what way? So not just for the results of the CDU, but then, of course, to the AfD.
Yeah, so migration has been obviously hotly debated in Germany since 2015, since Germany's opening, or better say, correctly, not closing the borders to Syrian refugees. Merkel's "we can do this" policy. That's something that was a tough pill to swallow for the conservatives. Merkel moved this Christian Democrats very much to the center. And these policies have long been overtaken. So even the center-left parties, the Social Democrats and the Greens, have moved beyond Merkel's position from their time. So German migration policies have definitely moved towards the right since the Merkel era. But there is a frustration among the public that many of the reforms that have been proposed on the German level, on the European level, in response to an asylum system that doesn't seem to be working properly, have not delivered sufficient results. So the migration discussion is dominated by the question, how can Germany expel asylum seekers who are not allowed to stay in Germany, despite the Dublin rules, and despite the difficulties to deport asylum seekers back to the countries where they come from. And this has become even more polarized after a series of terrorist attacks in Germany, conducted in parts by asylum seekers who should not have been in the country anymore, but should have already been deported to their home country. And Merz argues, and the conservatives argue, that this topic has to be addressed by closing Germany's borders, at least for a certain amount of time, because the German system is just overwhelmed with asylum seekers and with integrating asylum seekers, which would go against EU law, but had the support of a majority of Germans. Over 60% of Germans supported Merz's position because there's a widespread feeling that politics have not lost control over the migration topic, and that what the parties have done so far have not been sufficient to reform the system. But voters have also not liked Merz moving closer to the AfD on this topic. So they want a tougher migration policy. They actually support Merz's proposal to close the German borders, but they don't want to work with the AfD on this topic. So from Merz's perspective, there is a possibility for the conservatives to get this topic back from the radical right wing and to make it disappear as a problem in Germany. And they argue that just ignoring the problem and not speaking about it will only lead to an even stronger AfD in the next elections.
Absolutely. But of course, what the far right wants in terms of migration is to take it not just one, but many, many steps forward than what the conservative wants. And there was this proposal on the table of the so-called remigration that would, in practice, expel and deport German citizens that the far right, whoever, does not consider them to be integrated enough, by which standards one can only imagine. But considering that Merz will be forced to a coalition to his left, can we expect a softer stance on migration? So can the Social Democrats put a foot down on when it comes to more right-wing migration
Yeah, I think
policies?
it's important to distinguish between what the AfD demands and what Friedrich Merz and the conservatives demand. So the AfD's proposal about remigration is certainly not at all what the conservatives under Friedrich Merz want to see. They do agree with closing Germany's borders, but these radical right-wing proposals from the AfD are not what is shared as a policy within the Conservative Party. For Friedrich Merz, it will be difficult to give into concessions with the Social Democrats on migration policy because he has taken such a strong stance before the elections, again, risking the political risk of accepting AfD votes to push through a motion in parliament. So moving back on that in coalition negotiations he will probably perceive this as a lack of credibility on his part, and he will also argue that, well, I have the majority of Germans behind my proposals, over 60% in polls. So why should I move back on these roll back these positions and these issues? So it will be different. It will be easier for the Social Democrats to get concessions from Friedrich Merz on social welfare than on asylum and migration policy. But they will certainly try to play that card, because for the Social Democrats, Friedrich Merz accepting AfD votes has been something that gives them leverage in negotiations, to say, well, this is not a CDU we can work with unless there will be significant changes.
And at least on a positive note, Germany's new next chancellor already ruled out entering a coalition with the AfD. But as you already reminded us during this conversation, just last month, the CDU passed a motion in the Bundestag to tighten migration rules, and it did so with the backing of the AfD. So this far-right party secured 20% of the votes, so a doubling from the last results. How easy will it be to ignore the AfD? Can the firewall still hold?
Well, this term will be the test whether the firewall still hold. If Friedrich Merz manages to reform Germany's migration policy in a way which undercuts support for the AfD on migration, if he's able to bring back and to revive Germany's economy, then he has a chance to bring down the numbers for the AfD. If he's unable to do so, if a coalition with the Social Democrats is marked by political infighting, then it will be much more difficult, because then there will be additional frustration with Germany's political establishment building up, which can lead to even bigger election outcomes for the AfD in the next elections. And then in the next elections, it will be incredibly difficult to once again form a coalition against the AfD. So it is really Friedrich Merz's historical test on many fronts. He has a historical test on the international front with the Trump administration, with a completely changing international landscape with Russia and China. At the same time, he really has a historic test at the domestic front, whether his approach of reforming migration policy, tougher migration policy, and more liberal economic policies can actually pull away votes from the AfD.
So for my last question before I let you go, I was going to say that many are already looking at the next election in 2029, and apparently I can also put you in this group of people already looking 4 years into the future. Because of course, many fear that next time around, the AfD can actually, in the very least, become a coalition party in the next German government. I know this is going to be a big question, but what needs to happen until then to avoid a far-right party to enter government in Germany? You just mentioned that there has to be no infighting in the very least. But what else? I mean, do you believe that the far-right party can still be fought in the polls? Or is it also time to bring the judicial system into the fight?
It has been a long discussion in Germany whether the AfD, which is partly deemed extremist by the domestic intelligence services, should be prohibited, and should not be allowed to run anymore in elections as a political party. This is the suggestion that has been floated at the beginning of the rise of the AfD, and there's a very philosophical argument behind this. One argument goes, well, if we would have prohibited the national the party of Adolf Hitler, basically the NSDAP, in the 1930s, then we would have never seen their rise through democratic elections. This is something that the Weimar Republic has failed to do. But there's also the other argument that says, well, the AfD might be in increasing parts right-wing and extremist, but not all voters of the AfD will be right-wing and extremist. So with 20% of the vote, isn't the AfD already too big to just deal with them by saying this party is outlawed, and with the 20% of the voters, especially in Germany's east, where the party has between 40 and 50% of election results, to just say, well, we take away this option from you. So at the moment, the strategy of the German centrist parties and of the conservatives, which is the bulk, the bulwark against the AfD, is a strategy to really make progress on the two issues that bring voters to the AfD, which is the economic situation, inflation and prices, as well as the migration situation. And these are the 2 points that Friedrich Merz will have to deliver in a way which satisfies German voters. He believes he can do this. There are examples on the European level that say, well, this is more challenging than he might expect it is. But everyone who hopes for, who is against the AfD in Germany should wish Friedrich Merz all of luck and support many of his policies, because he and the conservatives, it's not the center-left parties, but it's he and the conservatives who will be the last party who is an alternative to the AfD to voters, and who will have to deliver on that.
And just very quickly, do you believe that's a winning strategy, not just in Germany, but across Europe, that the ruling parties need to deliver for its citizens, not just because they should do it, but also to prevent the rise of far
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. In Germany, there's strong belief that taming the AfD by bringing them into government will not work. Again, that's the lesson from the Weimar Republic. Bringing in the Nazis into power has also not worked back then. So it really is the delivering on the topics that are relevant, on migration, on the economy, to bring down the figures of the AfD. And let's remind ourselves that 20% is really new for the AfD. In the past, they have been at 10, 11, 12%. So there is a fair chance to revert those figures.
And that's it for today's show. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and Policy Voices will be back again next week. Until then, goodbye.